"You people don't belong in places like this," Dr. Randall Pruitt said, not even looking up from his clipboard. "Go find yourself a county clinic. That's what they're there for." Nadia O.C. Brewster didn't move. She stood at the nurse's station of Meridian General Hospital in her worn-out sneakers and her daughter's oversized hoodie, holding a manila folder of medical records against her chest, and she looked at Dr. Pruitt with the kind of absolute stillness that only comes from a person who has spent their entire life training themselves not to react. He had no idea what she was about to do to his career. The emergency department at Meridian General was loud on a Tuesday night, gurneys rolling, monitors beeping, a drunk man in Bay 3 singing something nobody recognized. Nadia had been sitting in the waiting area for 2 hours and 40 minutes watching. It was worse than the anonymous complaints had described. She watched Dr. Pruitt wave off an elderly black man's chest pain as anxiety without running a single test. She watched him spend 11 minutes with a white couple from the suburbs, laughing, explaining everything twice, drawing little diagrams on the paper lining of the exam table. She watched him tell a Haitian nursing assistant to repeat herself 3 times and then sigh like he was being personally victimized by the accent. Nadia had not come to Meridian General by accident. The file in her manila folder wasn't her medical records. It was a dossier, complaint logs, incident reports, 2 internal memos from the hospital's own risk management department that had been quietly buried, and the names of 14 patients across the last 3 years who had described the exact same thing in the exact same words. Dismissed, talked down to, sent away sicker than they arrived. 14 patients, all of them black. She had built the case herself over 6 months, pulling records, making calls, driving to people's houses when they wouldn't answer the phone, sitting at kitchen tables across from people who had long since given up expecting anything better. One woman, a retired schoolteacher named Cora, had described leaving this exact emergency department at 2 in the morning with a fever of 104 because Dr. Pruitt told her she was catastrophizing. She was admitted to a different hospital 3 days later with a severe kidney infection. She spent 9 days in the ICU. Nadia had read that report 4 times. She was a woman who understood the machinery of institutional neglect the way a mechanic understands an engine, down to the smallest, most corroded bolt. She had a degree in public health from Spelman, a law degree from Georgetown, and 8 years of experience working inside the Federal Office for Civil Rights before being appointed to lead the Division of Healthcare Equity Enforcement for the Department of Health and Human Services. Her division had jurisdiction over every hospital that accepted Medicare and Medicaid funding. Meridian General accepted both, but to Dr. Randall Pruitt, looking up briefly from his clipboard at the woman in the faded hoodie, standing at his nurse's station, she was an inconvenience, a nuisance, another patient trying to game the system. She had dressed carefully for tonight. The hoodie belonged to her 20-year-old daughter. The sneakers were 2 sizes past retirement. She had taken off her watch, removed her earrings, left her government credentials in the glove compartment of her car in the parking garage. She looked tired because she had driven 4 hours from Atlanta to be here. She looked ordinary, because ordinary was the point. She had learned a long time ago that people reveal everything when they believe no one important is watching. "Excuse me," Nadia said, stepping slightly closer to the counter. "I've been waiting since 7:15. I have documentation of a condition that—" "Ma'am." Dr. Pruitt finally looked up, and the look on his face was the particular brand of exhausted contempt that some people have preloaded and ready to deploy at a moment's notice. He was 53, silver-haired, with the ruddy complexion of a man who played racquetball 3 times a week and still considered himself above average. "I don't know what you think this is, but we have actual critical patients tonight. If your issue isn't a life-threatening emergency, I need you to go back to the waiting area and wait your turn like everyone else. I've been waiting my turn for 2 hours and 40 minutes. Nadia said, keeping her voice quiet. "Then wait 40 more. He turned back to his clipboard. "I have medical records." "I'm sure you do." He didn't turn around. "Everyone who comes in here has paperwork. A printout from WebMD, a note from some urgent care clinic, a screenshot from Facebook. None of it tells me anything I don't already know. These are records from 3 separate physicians spanning—" "Ma'am." He turned around then, and his voice dropped into that low, slow register that was designed to make someone feel stupid. "I have been doing this for 26 years. I have seen every trick in the book. every hustle, every story, every folder full of papers somebody put together to try and get a prescription they have absolutely no clinical need for. So let me be very clear with you. He leaned one hand against the counter and looked at her with something that wasn't quite contempt and wasn't quite pity and was somehow worse than either one. You are not going to walk in here with your little folder and your little story and jump a line of people who are actually sick. That's not how this works. You people don't belong in places like this. Go find yourself a county clinic. That's what they're there for. The nurses' station had gone very quiet. A young nurse named Petra, 2 years out of school and still at the age where she believed the system was basically fair, had stopped typing and was staring at her keyboard. Nadia did not react. She breathed slowly through her nose. She absorbed everything, the exact phrasing, the exact tone, the casual geographic cruelty of you people. The assumption about the prescriptions, the insinuation that she was faking, the dismissal of documents she hadn't even been allowed to open. She noted that Petra had gone still. She noted that a second nurse, older, had turned deliberately toward the medication cart and was very carefully not watching. "Okay," Nadia said quietly. "Thank you for your time, doctor." She turned and walked back through the waiting room, past the rows of plastic chairs and the vending machine with the flickering light, pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the parking lot. The night air was warm and smelled like asphalt. She pulled out her phone and dialed. "Tell me you got all of it," she said. "Every word," said the voice on the other end. His name was Darnell Okafor, a former OSHA investigator who now worked as her lead field auditor. He had been sitting in a car in the parking garage for 3 hours with a directional recorder and the patience of a man who had done far worse surveillance in far colder weather. "The bit about you people is going to hit hard. Pull the audio logs from the nurses' station too. I want the full environment capture. Already flagging it. Want me to subpoena the surveillance footage tonight or wait until morning?" "Wait until morning," Nadia said. She was already walking toward her car, her posture entirely different from what it had been inside. Shoulders back, stride long, the careful exhaustion of the disguise evaporating like fog. "I want to be in the building when the papers arrive. I want him to see them handed to administration in real time. You know he's going to lawyer up immediately," Darnell said. "Let him," Nadia said. "No lawyer on earth can make that recording sound like anything other than what it is." She got in the car, set the manila folder on the passenger seat, and sat for a moment in the dark. She thought about Cora. She thought about the 9 days in the ICU. She pulled out of the parking garage and drove toward her hotel room, 12 minutes away. She had a full day of work to do before morning. Meridian General Hospital had been considered untouchable for the better part of a decade. It was a prestigious regional medical center with a glossy new cardiac wing, and a philanthropic foundation that threw a gala every November at the Callaway Club. Its board of directors included 3 former city council members, a state senator's spouse, and the kind of locally famous attorney whose name appeared on buildings. It had a 4-star rating on the state health department's public scorecard, and a marketing budget dedicated almost entirely to making sure it kept it. Dr. Randall Pruitt was one of its most senior attending physicians. He had been named Department Head of Emergency Medicine 6 years ago, which meant he had structural authority over every interaction in that department and institutional protection stacked 3 layers deep. He was also, Nadia's team had determined, personally responsible for the lowest rate of diagnostic follow-up testing for Black patients in the entire region, a number so stark, so statistically impossible to explain as coincidence, that the data analyst on Nadia's team had run it 4 separate times before putting it in the official report, because she didn't want to believe the number was real. The morning after Nadia's visit, she was seated at a conference table on the 4th floor of Meridian General's administrative wing, across from the hospital's chief operating officer, a man named Garrett Holt, and its head of legal, a woman named Jolene Watts. They were polished and prepared, and radiating the particular energy of people who have been handling liability for long enough to be mostly unafraid of it. Nadia placed her federal credentials on the table between them. Holt looked at the credentials. He looked at Nadia. He looked at the credentials again. "We weren't notified of a formal inspection," Watts said carefully. "Division investigations at this tier don't require advance notice." Nadia said, "You're familiar with 45 CF Part 80. You accepted federal funding. That means you accepted our jurisdiction. She opened the folder she had brought with her, not the same manila folder from the night before, but a thick-bound document with the official seal of the Department of Health and Human Services on the cover. She slid it across the table. This is a formal notice of civil rights investigation. The basis is documented evidence of racially disparate treatment in your emergency department, spanning a period of approximately 3 years, including a first-hand incident that occurred last night at approximately 9:40 p.m. at the nurses' station of this facility. Watts picked up the document with the careful expression of a person who understands exactly how bad things have become and is trying not to let that understanding show on her face. "Last night," Holt repeated slowly. "Last night," Nadia confirmed. "You were here last night." "I was." There was a silence. Nadia waited through it calmly. "I'd like to contact our outside counsel," Watts said. "Of course," Nadia said. "I'd also like Dr. Pruitt notified that he is required to appear before a formal review panel at 10 o'clock Thursday morning. That's a mandatory appearance under the terms of your federal funding agreement. He's welcome to bring representation." The meeting ended shortly after. Nadia walked out into the 4th-floor hallway, took the elevator down, and was crossing the hospital lobby toward the exit when she heard quick footsteps behind her. "Excuse me." She turned. It was Petra, the young nurse from the previous night. She was out of scrubs, clearly just arriving for a shift, her lanyard still half tucked into her jacket pocket. She looked nervous in the specific way that people look when they have decided to do something that frightens them. "You were here last night," Petra said. "At the nurse's station, I was," Nadia said. "I heard what he said to you." Petra swallowed. It wasn't the first time. "I've watched him do it, not those exact words, but the same thing, every week. I've written it up twice internally and nothing happened." She looked down at her shoes, then back up. "Is there somewhere I can make a formal statement?" Nadia looked at her for a moment. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a card. "Call that number by 5 o'clock today," Nadia said. "Ask for Darnell. He'll walk you through the process and make sure your employment protections are in writing before you put anything on record." Petra took the card with both hands. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you," Nadia said. Thursday morning came in fast and grey, the kind of overcast southern morning that presses down on everything like a lid. Dr. Randall Pruitt arrived at Meridian General 45 minutes before the 10 o'clock hearing in a charcoal suit, and with an attorney named Martin Avery, who was the kind of lawyer whose reputation in the region was built almost entirely on being expensive enough that problems went away. Avery was 60, silver, and carried himself like a man who had sat across from federal investigators before and found the experience manageable. They were shown to a conference room on the 3rd floor. It had been configured for the hearing, a long table, a stenographer, a recording device, and 3 seats on one side for the federal panel. Pruitt sat down, straightened his jacket, and reviewed his prepared statement with Avery in low, confident tones. He had spent 2 days with Avery constructing an explanation. Stress, understaffing, a miscommunication. He had never intended to imply anything discriminatory. He was a physician of 30 years. His record was exemplary. This was a politically motivated overreach by a federal agency with an agenda. He was still going over his notes when the door opened. The 3 panel members entered. 2 of them were federal auditors Pruitt had never seen before. He gave them a brief, dismissive glance. The 3rd person walked to the center seat, sat down, and opened a binder. Pruitt's eyes moved to her face. There was a beat. One of those moments where the brain receives information and for a fraction of a second refuses to process it because the processing would be too catastrophic. The women, the hoodie, the worn sneakers, the folder, the nurse's station. The woman now sitting in the center seat in a sharp navy blazer with a federal credentials placard in front of her was the same woman he had told to go find a county clinic because people like her didn't belong in places like this. The same woman, the same dark, entirely unhurried eyes. Pruitt made a sound he would never be able to fully describe afterward. Something between a cleared throat and a collapsed breath. His hand shot out and gripped Avery's forearm. Avery looked at Pruitt. Pruitt was the color of old chalk. Avery followed his gaze to the center seat. He looked at the credentials placard. He looked at the case file in front of him, which read, Federal Investigation Meridian General, Complainant, N. O.C. Brewster, Division Director, Office of Healthcare Equity Enforcement. Martin Avery, who had sat across from federal investigators many times and found the experience manageable, was quiet for a long time. He slowly closed his legal pad. Nadia did not smile. She pressed the button on the recording device, adjusted her microphone, and looked down the table. "Good morning," she said, and her voice in the small room had a clarity and an authority that bore no resemblance whatsoever to the quiet, apologetic register she had used at the nurses' station 2 nights ago. "This is a formal evidentiary hearing pursuant to Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the applicable provisions of the Affordable Care Act. The respondent is Dr. Randall Pruitt, attending physician and department head, emergency medicine, Meridian General Hospital." Pruitt tried to speak. His voice came out wrong. I didn't. I wasn't aware that the woman you told to find a county clinic was the federal officer currently conducting an investigation into your department," Nadia said. She said it without inflection. She said it as a sentence, not a weapon, because she didn't need a weapon. "No, you were not aware. I'd like to make sure the record reflects why that is relevant." She opened the binder and withdrew the printed transcript of Tuesday night's nurses' station exchange. Darnell had formatted it cleanly. Time-stamped, speaker attributed, authenticated with the audio file, reference number at the top. She began to read it aloud. It was worse in the conference room than it had been in the parking lot, hearing it replayed in her head, stripped of the noise and chaos of the emergency department, with a stenographer's fingers moving and a recording device's red light blinking. Every phrase landed with a different weight. "You people don't belong in places like this. Go find yourself a county clinic. Everyone who comes in here has a hustle. I have seen every trick in the book." Every time Nadia read a phrase, Pruitt flinched. Not dramatically, just the smallest involuntary contraction, like a man being tapped on a bruise. Avery had stopped taking notes. In addition to the audio record from Tuesday evening, Nadia continued, setting the transcript down. "This investigation has obtained the following: signed affidavits from 2 current Meridian General employees documenting repeated incidents of disparate treatment by the respondent over a period of not less than 18 months. Statistical analysis of diagnostic follow-up testing rates by patient race in the respondent's department over 3 years, which shows a disparity of 41 percentage points between black and white patients with comparable presenting symptoms, and 14 documented patient complaints submitted to hospital administration, none of which resulted in disciplinary action." She looked at Pruitt directly for the first time since the hearing had begun. 14 complaints, she said quietly. Not one of them was investigated. Not because the complaints lacked merit, because the patients who filed them were poor, were black, were unrepresented, and were easy to ignore. A pause. Cora Sims was admitted to St. Augustine Medical Center with a grade 3 kidney infection, 9 days after leaving your emergency department following your assessment. She is 71 years old. She spent the better part of 2 weeks in intensive care. Another pause. "Do you remember Cora Sims, Dr. Pruitt?" Pruitt's jaw moved. Nothing came out. For the record, the respondent declined to answer, Nadia said to the stenographer, who nodded. Avery leaned over and whispered something urgent into Pruitt's ear. Pruitt listened, his face still the color of old chalk, and nodded once, a small, jerky motion. "My client is prepared to offer a full written apology and submit voluntarily to an independent clinical review," Avery said, straightening. "We ask the panel to consider Dr. Pruitt's 30 years of service and his otherwise clean disciplinary record." "Mr. Avery," Nadia said, and the softness in her voice was not warmth, it was precision. "Your client's otherwise clean disciplinary record exists because the 14 people who complained about him were not believed. It exists because a system that was supposed to catch exactly this kind of misconduct decided 14 separate times that their experiences were not worth pursuing." She looked at him steadily. "That record is not a mitigating factor in these proceedings. It is part of the evidence." The silence in the room was complete. Nadia picked up the last document in the binder. "The Division of Healthcare Equity Enforcement is recommending the following to the Department of Health and Human Services: immediate suspension of Dr. Randall Pruitt's authority as department head pending full investigation, mandatory independent audit of emergency department practices and patient outcome data for the preceding 5 years, and formal notification to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services of potential funding compliance violations by Meridian General Hospital pending findings." She set the document down. "Furthermore, we are referring the clinical findings regarding patient Cora Sims and 6 additional cases identified in our preliminary audit to the Georgia Composite Medical Board for independent review of the standard of care provided. Pruitt made a sound. It was quiet. It was something in the range of a man who had spent 30 years building a professional identity on the assumption that certain people didn't matter, and is now sitting in a room where that assumption has collapsed completely, and without mercy. "This hearing is adjourned," Nadia said. "Dr. Pruitt, you will receive formal written notice of the suspension within 24 hours. Please ensure you are reachable by the contact information on file." She closed the binder. She did not look at him again. The fallout moved fast, the way these things do once the right people are paying attention. By Friday, the story was on the wire. A federal civil rights division director had gone undercover at a regional hospital in Georgia and documented, firsthand, what 14 patients had been trying to report for 3 years. The details were specific, the audio was damning, and the statistical data was the kind of number that a journalist can put in a headline and a reader can understand without any background knowledge. Black patients in Pruitt's department received follow-up diagnostic testing at a rate 41 points lower than white patients. 41 points. 3 years. 14 complaints. One county clinic remark. By the following Tuesday, Meridian General's board had called an emergency session. The hospital's CEO, who had not been present at Thursday's hearing, issued a public statement that used the word accountability 4 times and the phrase "we take these findings extremely seriously" 3 times, and mentioned Dr. Pruitt's name exactly once in the passive voice in connection with the administrative leave that had already been implemented. Thomas Vance, that is, the hospital's retained PR firm, issued a separate statement. Pruitt did not issue a statement. The Georgia Composite Medical Board opened its review. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services sent their own auditors. It took 6 weeks. At the end of 6 weeks, the findings were what they were, which was to say they were indefensible, which is a word that means the same thing in medicine and law. There is nothing left to hide behind. Dr. Randall Pruitt surrendered his medical license voluntarily on a Wednesday morning in October in a conference room at the Georgia Composite Medical Board offices with Martin Avery beside him and nobody else. The voluntary surrender was, in legal terms, an admission. He filed the paperwork, signed his name, and walked out of the building into a cold grey morning. He was 53 years old. He had been a physician for 30 years. He had spent 30 years in a field dedicated to the proposition that every human life has equal value, and he had spent those 30 years acting as though that proposition had an asterisk. 6 months later, on a Thursday morning in the spring, Nadia O.C. Brewster was at her desk in Atlanta, working through a stack of new case files. Her office had windows that faced east, and in the morning the sun came in long and flat across the desk. It was a good office to work in early. Darnell knocked on the open door and came in carrying 2 cups of coffee and a summary report. "Meridian's new emergency department director started Monday," he said, setting 1 cup on her desk. "Her name's Dr. Yolanda Pierce, 44, trained at Johns Hopkins, did a fellowship in health equity at Stanford. She's already restructured the intake protocol and implemented a real-time disparity tracking system." "Good," Nadia said without looking up from the file. "Heard Pruitt tried to get a consulting gig at a private practice in Savannah," Darnell added. "Didn't pan out." Nadia nodded once. She picked up the file and read for a moment. She thought about Cora. She thought about all the people who had sat in those plastic chairs and handed someone a folder of papers and been told that their pain was a performance, that their presence was an inconvenience, that they needed to go somewhere else because they didn't belong in places like this. She thought about what it costs a person to keep asking for something they deserve. She set the file down, picked up her coffee, and turned toward the window. The morning light was already changing, the way it does when a day is moving on ahead of you, and there is still a great deal of work to be done. She turned back to her desk, opened the next file, and got started.